All my heroes, and if you ever spend time with me at my clinic in Santa Rosa, one of the things I'll do almost every day is I will tell you about the people whose shoulders I stand upon, about people who have talked about good nutrition for years, hundreds of years. And these are the people that I study, that I have great respect for. I've just simply stated they're my heroes. There are people like Russell Henry Chittenden, who I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about in a minute. He was the head of Yale's biochemistry department. He's the father of biochemistry. Walter Kempner, who set up Duke's program, the rice diet at Duke University. In the 1950s, Walter Kempner had published essentially all the things that I do today in my practice of medicine. He showed that you could take people with severe high blood pressure. I'm talking like 210 over 140. Not the wimpy blood pressure you guys are on pills for. He would take and put them on a rice diet, and he would reverse their blood pressure. He would take enlarged hearts and reverse them to normal in half the cases. Electrocardiograms that were abnormal, they'd reverse to normal by putting them on this kind of diet. He'd stop kidney failure. He would reverse diabetic retinopathy. All this is published in the 1950s. Walter Kempner was the most famous thing at Duke University for 40 years, the rice diet. We have Roy Swank. Roy Swank was the head of neurology at the University of Oregon for 23 years. He used a low-fat, plant-based, low-animal food diet to treat multiple sclerosis. It's the only treatment that works. The only way you can stop this disease. He has research on over 5,000 patients. It involves 50 years of research, 200 published papers that say that if you have multiple sclerosis, the chance of you getting worse if you follow a healthy diet over the next 35 years is less than 5%. If you follow any other therapy, I don't care if you spend $12,000 or $15,000 or $20,000 a year on it, your risk of being dead, wheelchair-bound, or bedridden within 10 years is 50%. We have Dennis Burkitt. He's the fiber man. I love to talk about Dennis Burkitt. Someday maybe I'll give you a whole hour lecture about how that man taught me the important things that I know today. Here's a doctor who was the head of the Ministries of Health of Uganda. He trained in Edinburgh, Scotland, learned how to be a surgeon to treat heart disease, diabetes, hemorrhoids, varicose veins, deep vein thrombosis, appendicitis. But he became the head of the Ministries of Health of Uganda and Africa, and he practiced there 15 years, and he didn't find any of these diseases. And he blamed it on the fact that these people ate a high-fiber diet. And of course, you all know fiber is only present in plants. Nathan Pritikin, many of you are familiar with. James Anderson at the University of Kentucky Medical School treated diabetics in the mid-70s with the diet I recommend, and was able to get most diabetics off of insulin, about 2/3 to 3/4, type 2, by the way, type 2 diabetics, and essentially all of them off of their diabetic pills. And of course, you know Dean Ornish's famous studies on reversing heart disease. So see, these are some of my heroes. I want to talk to you about protein for a minute. Protein is one of those things that's really hard for you to get over, and of course you associate protein with meat and eating dairy products. Did you ever wonder how people reach the recommendation for your protein requirements? It was done in the late 1800s. And it was done by well-meaning scientists like Carl Voigt from Germany and Charles Atwater from the United States and various other investigators. This is what they did. No more, no less. They looked at the populations around them, and they came to the conclusion that people would intuitively choose the right foods. So if you weren't wealthy enough to make these choices, you obviously couldn't be included in the discussion. So they had to include soldiers and laborers and office people, more successful people. If you could afford to eat meat or plant foods, all kinds of different foods, obviously their assessment was people would intuitively choose the right thing. And so they looked at what people who were wealthier in their societies ate, and they decided that's how much protein you need. The arrogance, the stupidity. I mean, look at your friends and relatives. Do they intuitively choose Krispy Kreme donuts correctly? I promise you that is all the research that was done to determine the protein needs that your doctor recommends for you today. It was based on social bigotry, assuming wealthy people are smarter than people who can't afford to eat rich food. That was all it was due to. Well, a guy named Russell Henry Chittenden, he was upset about this. And Russell Henry Chittenden, he, as I said, was head of biochemistry at Yale University in the early 1900s, published his book, Physiological Economy and Nutrition in 1904. Now, he had a problem with the current recommendations, and his problem was this, is when he looked around the world, like, for example, he looked in Central America, he looked in Africa, he looked in Asia, he saw millions of people living on protein intakes about half as much as these folks were recommending. They were recommending 130 to 180 grams a day. He saw people living on 60, 70, 80 grams a day, and he says, there's something probably wrong. Plus, he met vegetarians. And he said, they're alive. My goodness, they're alive. How could they be alive eating 40, 50, 60 grams of protein a day when everybody knows they shouldn't be? And so he's decided to test this out. And so what he did is he did some experiments. The first one was on himself. I mean, you don't rush into this. You might hurt somebody. So he tested himself. And he changed his diet from around 120 grams of protein a day to 40 grams of protein a day. And he lost weight and he felt better. And his arthritic knees improved to the point where they didn't bother him anymore. And he was so excited. So what he did next is he took some of his colleagues. He took 5 of the Yale faculty and he put them on the diet. He carefully chose these faculty as people who didn't exercise because he didn't want to overdo this now. He didn't want to rush into it. And he put them on the diet. They lost weight and felt better. And next he took people who exercised a little more. He took 13 hospital corpsmen from the Army. They were more physically active, plus they vigorously exercised one day a week. He put them on the diet, and they all thrived and lost weight. And then his final test, he took 7 Yale athletes. These are Olympic athletes. He put them on the diet, and they improved their performance by 35%. And that was in 1904 this was published. 100 years ago, and still the same nonsense about protein is being taught. One of my other heroes is William Rose. He published his final work in 1952. He published 16 papers which are in the journals of biochemistry, which are considered nutritional classics. Some of the most important papers ever published in the scientific literature were published by William Rose. He started out studying rats. Why did he study rats? Because rats were the model for nutrition. And some investigators by the name of Osborne and Mendel, they did some studies back in 1913 that showed, you may remember these studies, they were published in your textbooks. In your textbooks, what it showed was when you fed the rats vegetable protein, they grew poorly. That was class B or inferior protein. And then when you add a little meat to the rat's diet, they grew great, and so meat was class A or superior protein. Do you remember those charts? I had them in my books. Well, that's from Osborne and Mendel's experiments in 1913. Now, what Osborne and Mendel didn't figure out back then was that rats weren't people. And so as a result, they got it wrong. But William Rose came around to figuring that out. He straightened that all out by doing this. He took his college students and he put them on various kinds of diets to determine what they needed in terms of protein and amino acids. And he found out that we were more efficient than rats and that our amino acid requirements and protein requirements were very small. As a matter of fact, this chart, which you'll find in many of my books, this chart right here, which you'll find in many of my books, clearly shows what Rose found, and that is that amino acid requirements and protein requirements are easily met by any single plant food. Not only are the requirements that are designated as recommended requirements met, but requirements that are designated, not only are requirements that are designated as minimum are met, but requirements that are twice that large, which are designated as recommended, are met by any single plant food. Now, people should have been able to figure this out because they actually had this data in the 1930s and 40s, and that's the data on the protein content of the milk of various animals. And what you find is the protein content of human breast milk is very, very low. We have 1.2 grams for every 100 grams of fluid milk. Now, why is the protein content in humans so low? The reason is because humans grow slowly. It takes about 17 years for a human to grow from birth to adulthood. Whereas animals that grow faster, they need more protein. So if you look at the protein content of various animals and you look at their rate of growth, you see why other animals have different needs for protein. For example, a cow doubles in size in 47 days, whereas a human being takes 180 days.